Welcome, everybody. I know that this is the center of the universe for optics, so I thought I'd teach you a little light. But it's an interesting thing. It's a curiosity. A lot of people don't quite understand where the definition of light comes from. It's actually part of the SI system. It's up with mass and we got a problem?
No, I'm trying to see if I can reduce the light here. So
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. It's a lighting problem. Typical. So I want to first of all thank Dr. Marcos, who Dr. Figueroa and I met this last summer, and she was gracious enough to drag in a lot of her colleagues here. So thank you all for the time you spent. So I hope that you see a different perspective maybe on light that you have up to this time. It isn't just a matter of simple optical radiation. So let me make sure I can. So one of the things that we're a new center with Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, you may have heard of. It's one of the top hospitals in the country, set in Manhattan. We are a satellite. You can see that where we are up the Hudson River. That's where our main laboratory is. But we have about the same number of people down in New York as we do in Albany. Down in New York is primarily focused on clinical trials, whereas most of the laboratory work is up in the Albany area. And you can see the diversity of projects that we're working on, anything from plant health to transportation, energy efficiency. And we collaborate with people literally around the world in many of these research projects. In fact, that's one of the keystones of our center is we have a long history of collaboration. So in fact, I hope that we might find some collaboration here at University of Rochester. Now, what I'm going to talk about is the circadian system. And as you'll see, that light is a powerful driver of the circadian system. The name comes from circa, meaning approximately, dias, about 1 day. And these are what we call intrinsic clock inside the brain. Without any light, with anything else, you will go through a circadian rhythm that includes things like sleep. When you go to the bathroom, when you're hungry, all of those things are under the control of the circadian system. That is the timing of when it's optimum to do it. And the important point is that it's the 24-hour cycle of light and dark that drives the circadian system. So if you fly to Paris and they have a different, with regard to your local watch here, a sunrise, sunset that's different than it was when you left Rochester, your whole biological clock has to what we call re-entrain to the new light-dark pattern, which is 24 hours in the, as I said, in the brain. Now, as I mentioned, we have a wide range of circadian rhythms, and I would venture to say that if you stick a probe in any part of the body, you will find a daily rhythm in its behavior one way or the other. Overt behavior like sleep-wake, but everything down to the molecular level is governed by a circadian clock. So you have this master clock in your brain. It's called the suprachiasmatic nuclei. It's bisymmetrical, and it's composed of a core and a shell. Each one has an autonomous neuron that goes through a cycle. And the RHT is the retinal hypothalamic tract that is a direct connection to the eyes in humans. Now, birds can have a direct stimulation of their clock through their skulls. That's why you call them bird brains. But the point is that every creature on the face of Earth has a circadian clock and goes through that daily cycle. So, as I mentioned, that each cell in the suprachiasmatic nucleus has its own intrinsic period. And one of the things that happens is you get a difference between what we call the core and the shell. And if you ablate those core neurons, you will not have a regulated circadian clock in the core. Now, light changes the phase of these oscillating neurons. And what you do is that if you have a light pulse that comes into the suprachiasmatic nucleus from the eye over the retinal hypothalamic tract. You will then stimulate directly these, at this point, asynchronous or potentially out of phase circadian cells. Now, they core, which is directly coupled to the retina, then
You sent a new link that works. Oops.
I don't know who that was. But what's interesting too is that as you get down to this very small level, the period of the core and the shell are different. And so as you'll see, the light dark pattern drives the core drives the shell, and then you have these output that go to various parts, either neurally or through a hormonal connection. Now, the light pulse, if you are, say, in the dark, you're in a cave for a day, and you get a light pulse, these cells start to scramble, and then they have to readapt to or retrain to this new light dark pattern. And that pulse can take up to 8 days or so for you to begin to re-entrain to that period. So jet lag, as you go from here to Paris or whatever, you aren't fully entrained. Every system in your body takes about a week to be able to synchronize to Paris time. And just as you get used to that 1 week vacation, you come back to New York and you got to start all over again. But there is this tight coupling, and this is the important thing in humans, between the eye, the retina, and how it talks to the biological clock. Now, without a light dark pattern, what you find is what's called free running. So this chart on the right shows each day when a mouse begins to run with regard to clock time. And what you see is that each day you have this advancing behavior pattern, the onset of activity in this mouse. It's going through a circadian pattern, but it's not 24 hours and it's not synchronized with anything in the environment because it's in a perfectly dark day. The yellow bars represent a long light pulse. Then what you can see is then, because it's a nocturnal rodent, when the light pulse goes off, the animal starts to run. Now, the important point is that nocturnal animals, like rodents, have an intrinsic period slightly shorter than 24 hours. Humans, on the other hand, have an intrinsic period slightly longer than 24 hours. And so the human, training stimulus typically is the first thing you get up in the morning. That's the light that is going to entrain it. For a mouse, it's the evening. The evening light is the thing that begins to entrain the mouse. Now, what you have here is this clock. We understand on average, the period is 24.2 hours in humans. But not everybody in this room necessarily would have that. In fact, what you see here are 3 outcome measures of circadian phase. One is core body temperature. You swallow a pill and through telemetry, it'll communicate what your core body temperature is. And you look at that over kind of how long it's inside. You can measure your circadian period with what's called minimum core body temperature. That is the marker. The other is when the onset of the nocturnal hormone called melatonin rises, and that becomes a marker also for circadian phase. But what you see here is people vary sitting in the dark in a dark cave and led them to their own devices. Some are longer than 24 hours, even though you're a diurnal species, some are shorter. So the question is, how is it that we begin to work as a society? We get up in the morning, we go to work, we go to bed, we do the same cycle over and over again. With these people that are not synchronized to a light dark pattern, they would be all asynchronous. In fact, that's what we found when we worked with nuclear submarines, that we found that the sailors who were without access to bright days and dark nights, they were all on a different circadian time because they had no strong entraining stimulus. So it is the sunrise and sunset on the surface of the earth that drives the circadian timing for every creature, I'll say, on the planet, from plants to animals, including humans. Now, I'm hoping this will run. Now, think of this, each person, these are 2 people. One has a slightly longer than 24 hours and another has a slightly shorter than 24 hours. And as you can see, they quickly become out of phase. Now, what you'll see is this table will oscillate And it'll go from daytime when the arrow's pointing to the left, and then it'll nighttime when it's pointing to the right. And they come in, they come out of phase. And so this is the way the sailors were in the submarine. Some were awake, some were asleep during the times that, well, they were sleepy, I should say. They were forced to get up. So think of this as sunrise, sunset. And the person is now getting this light-dark pattern on the retina. And what you begin to see is that everybody begins to synchronize to this exogenous stimulus of light and dark, light and dark. And they'll stay in phase as long as you have a governing stimulus like sunrise, sunset. So if you're a fisherman or a farmer or somebody else that works outside, you're going to be very tightly entrained to the light-dark pattern. Now, I'll get into a little later, but this light is not a full daytime exposure. This is a fairly weak daytime stimulus. They're sitting in right now. You see perfectly well. But biologically, this is not a particularly robust light pattern as you go through. And you can see when you stop, you go back in the cave, people become asynchronous one more time. So the metaphor we use of this, where at the beginning is the two girls, one pushing the swing and the other girl in the swing. Left to her own devices, that girl in the swing will swing in a period, whatever she decides to do. But the girl pushing is the light-dark pattern, and she governs the period that girl's going to have. And as long as you have a strong pattern, even though she may want to go faster or slower, it is the girl that's pushing, which is the light-dark pattern that sets the phase. So this tight coupling between the exogenous light-dark pattern and this biological clock drives behavior like sleep. And the other point that I want to make is if you don't do that, you become asynchronous, and then there are a whole series of problems, health-related problems at just about every level that you begin to see that begin to emerge. You have a question?
Yeah. What about the blind population? Does it affect them?
They free run. So they will come in and out of cycle with you that have eyes that are synchronized in the light-dark pattern. You can take oral melatonin that helps get you in phase, that will pharmaceutically get you back in phase, but it's very difficult. The light-dark pattern is much stronger than taking melatonin as an oral supplement. But yes, they'll become asynchronous.
In other parts of the body doesn't help.
I'm sorry?
For blind people, I mean, if they go out in the sun, does that help, or does it help to come in through the eye?
Being blind is a graded thing, right? So I'm talking about somebody with no eyes, but there are things like you'll have photoreceptor degeneration. You may still have intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which we'll talk about in a minute, that may indeed pick up the light-dark pattern as you go outside. So being blind is not binary. You can have variations in that, right? So, but I'm talking about removing the eyes, you then become asynchronous with everybody else in society. Yes.
So when it comes to Zeitgebers, if you don't have any light, and you just talked about this, if you're doing mice in a basement or something like that, and aren't they very, very sensitive to like the elevator, the sound or vibration or other things can become the Zeitgeber?
No. There are fruit flies that are temperature sensitive, that it warms up during the day, but humans are light dark. Now you can modify that by diet, for example. You can put people, force them to eat in the nighttime as opposed to daytime. Your liver will train to when you feed and when you don't. But in terms of the master clock, it's the light dark pattern that does it. Okay. But there are rebellious organs like the liver that will track whatever other phase you want to get into. Okay. Now, the rhetorical question is, what is light? And I'm not going to have you raise hands, but I will just simply tell you, light is a biophysical construct. It's not based on physics alone, but it's based upon experiments that were done in the 1920s that determined, as you can see in the left panel, what's called the photopic luminous efficiency function. So you take the electromagnetic spectrum, you measure irradiance, you multiply by that weighting function, and that is the definition of light. Now, this definition was created to support the lighting industry, but all the instruments we use routinely, like the luminance meters here, are all calibrated with this photopic luminous efficiency function. And that is the formal definition of light. It's not optical radiation. It's not infrared or ultraviolet. There's ultraviolet light is an oxymoron. It can't be light because it's outside the luminous efficiency function. So I'm going to try to explain to you how we developed a biophysical construct, not for flicker photometry, which is this is based on, and some of you may know what flicker photometry is, but based upon other biological outcome measures to develop another biophysical construct that we'll call circadian light. So how do we do that? Well, we have what's called the hormone of darkness, which is melatonin. And what it does is you, in the center panel, you'll see the dotted lines are when you go to sleep and when you get up, and you begin to see melatonin begin to rise at night in anticipation of you going to sleep. It then peaks mid-sleep, then comes down and begins to dissipate. So you do not have melatonin concentrations in measurable amounts during the daytime. And that's true for not only diurnal species like us, but it's also true for nocturnal species like animals. Now, the light comes in, it's the one on the right, it's transduced, goes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, it then goes through the superior cervical ganglion cell, down through the spinal column, back up into the brain to the pineal. And what it does is if you expose somebody to light, you will suppress in a graded response the synthesis of melatonin. That is our outcome measure. That is what we're going to see to say, if I change the spectrum, if I change the amount, if I change the duration, I'm going to look at how melatonin is affected. And the one on the left, we can either do with blood plasma sampling or through saliva or urine. Any biofluid, you can basically get a melatonin rhythm. Easiest thing, and the ones we use most often, is saliva. People would rather spit than give blood, as it turns out. So if I do that, here's an experiment from 2001, a group in Surrey. And what you see on the x-axis is the energy that you're providing to the cornea for a 472 nanometer light. And on the y-axis, you have how effective was it at suppressing melatonin with respect to darkness. So you get a 20%, for this particular experiment, you get a 20% reduction in melatonin synthesis at 472 nanometers at 10 to the 13th photons per centimeter per second. Now, you do that for a variety of wavelengths, and you end up not only wavelengths, but amounts. That's critical. And now you have a response characteristic for different wavelengths using melatonin suppression as the outcome measure. You fit a function to it, a logistic, and then what you do is you then take a constant criterion response, in this case it's the half saturation constant, and you project across this till you end up projecting down to the abscissa, and from that you can determine how much photons per centimeter squared per second are you affecting it, and from that you take the ratio and you end up with a luminous efficiency function for the circadian system. This particular one, as you can see, peaks at 456 nanometers. Now, I'm sure you didn't remember the photopic luminous efficiency function. It peaks at 555 nanometers. So this is antithetical to light as the lighting industry defines it. Okay, this is another definition biophysically. Now, remarkably, there was a study published exactly the same day from Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia, and they also were able to create a luminous efficiency function for a different set of wavelengths, but they overlap. And from that, you can now determine a spectral sensitivity function based upon nocturnal melatonin suppression. And what's remarkable is that these two studies fit very nicely together using this constant criterion response. I want to point out that one study used 90-minute exposures and the other used 30-minute exposures. And obviously there's quite a bit difference in terms of how much melatonin you suppress at 90 minutes versus 30, but it's a relative measure. You take a constant criterion and now you can rectify those two independent experiments into a single set of luminous efficiency. So this is light formally defined by the photopic luminous efficiency function, V lambda, and you can see it's very different So when you set lighting standards in a room, they're using V lambda. And you can see that you can be way off on how biologically effective or ineffective a light might be if you use a conventional light meter to tell me how much light did I get at a particular time. Now, one of the things that we've learned since 1924 is V lambda is driven largely by the L and M cones. You have an S cone, which is the orphan photoreceptor. It just doesn't count when it comes to commerce. You have different pre-retinal filters, you have rods, you have intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells that peak nominally around 490 once pre-retinal filtering is taken into account. And then I would argue that this, what we call U lambda, is actually the luminous efficiency function that defines light because it's the full band of sensitivity, but that's a different story. So what I'm going to talk to you now about is the model we used to characterize light for the human circadian system. And I want to, this is a really nice quote from people that are working in circadian rhythms. The model should be minimally complex to account for existing data and maximally specific about what its parameters mean in physiological terms. The essence of a model is usefulness. Usefulness is being simplification of nature rather than approaching the complexity of nature itself. So if I can't explain everything, it's not my fault. I'm just trying to model how it is we do it to become useful in the application of circadian effective light in, say, architectural spaces or nuclear submarines. So we have published these papers. The first one was 2005. It did the first phototransduction model. Then we updated that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I guess now. And this is a schematic diagram of the retina based upon that model. And you can see that it goes from the outer segments all the way to the ganglion cell layer. And I'm guessing most of you are familiar. I don't have to repeat interplexiform layer and the outer nuclear layer and so on. Is that true or false? The no means I don't, or no means I do.
We don't necessarily.
Okay, all right. I don't want to waste anybody's time. The point is that this is the wiring diagram as we conceive of it in terms of the model of how the retina converts optical radiation into circadian effective light. Now, it all starts with the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, first identified by David Berson in 2002. And what you have here is both a planar view and a cross-section of that particular cell. Very rare, less than 1% of the ganglion cells in the retina are these intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. As I'll talk about later, the opsin inside these cells, from the dendrites all the way through the opsin, to the axon, is melanopsin is the opsin that is there. It's been identified and by Iggy Provencio back before that. Now, these are very diffuse cells, but what we've developed then is this core piece. This is the linchpin of the model, is the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cell. So this is the way that the retina communicates to the biological clock. And in the model, it's a two-state model. And I'll explain to you why it's two-state in a minute. But you have, as it turns out, when the blue minus yellow channel is less than 0, you're in one state. And then when you switch to the other side, you become a spectrally opponent yellow. It switches to another equation. And that's how we're going to explain the data. You have to account for pre-retinal filtering. So you have to screen the melanopsin as it is by itself, taking account of the pre-retinal filtering from the crystalline lens, and then the macular pigment you have to take out of because of the cone fundamentals tend to include it, the dendron, the fovea, the macular pigment, so you factor that out. So in our equation then, we are taking into account both the crystalline lens and the macular pigment. Now, this is not an accurate drawing, and I apologize for not having a better drawing, but the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells are illustrated here wrongly in terms of these red on-ganglion cells. Now, they're peculiar in that they have these dendrites, and these are bad boys because what they do is their dendrites are in the outermost interplexiform layer where any honest to goodness off cell should be synapsing, but it doesn't. So that's a curiosity. And then it has, under low light levels, it looks like it works through, in our modeling, the A2 amacrine to actually switch between states and give a high threshold. So just as a sense of scale, a mouse is about 3,000 times more sensitive to circadian light than a human. And you have to come up with an explanation. Why do you have a high threshold for diurnal animals? Now, as it turns out, you have a direct connection between the rod bipolar to the IP retinal ganglion cell in a mouse. You do not have that in a human. Now, obviously what happens is that there's a switching between photopic, which is the daytime light level, that's where the photopic luminosufficiency function, and the rod only scotopic system. So you have this cone bipolar, and what we have is on the left, this one designated A is this conventional conversion from a rod bipolar to a cone bipolar to a single on ganglion cell. You don't have separate ganglion cells for rods and cones. They share that path up through the brain. This is the site of that change, and that becomes important because what we'll show is a threshold term that you have to put in to the model to explain the high threshold. And then the B is part of that, and when the cones become active, they disconnect the A2 amacrine cell, which has been holding the IP retinal ganglion cells at high threshold. And so it turns out to be, that's what the bi-state is. It's either a blue signal or a yellow signal, and it depends on which state you're in on how the model is going to behave. So this is the rod threshold term that sets the absolute threshold. And then what you have is this retinal ganglion cell. Now, I mentioned that it's very peculiar. In 2005, we didn't quite understand that, but it turns out that these dendrites that are synapsing in the off sublayer have what's called en passant synapses with the rod bipolar. With S-cone bipolar. So what happens is it bypasses the traditional throughput that you would get normally, should be synapsing in the on-cellular layer, but this en passant connection seems to be the one that is explaining how do you get from an off layer to an on response by the IP retinal ganglion cell. So this is the S-cone bipolar. And what happens is when you reach that photopic level, you pass through scotopic, mesopic, and now you're photopic. What it does is it disconnects then the A2 amacrine cell so that you're setting the threshold from that. And it also has direct throughput. Now, this is the one that Sarah has identified with the team out in Washington, this S-cone amacrine cell that in our modeling ensures that you have an on consistency. Otherwise, if you didn't have some way to control the off response by this biphasic cell, you would not be able to maintain this orthodoxy that you have off pass and you have on pass. And if you didn't have something, we're speculating that that's what this job is to actually maintain that on response from the S-cone bipolar to the IP retinal ganglion cell. But what's also interesting is if you have a so-called warm source, now the yellow signal is greater than the blue signal, you have a way of disconnecting that. So this is the bi-state. So what happens is you can't see a yellow response. It now disconnects the A2 amacrine cell from that synapse. And so you end up with a blue response that is going to be combined depending on the spectrum with the IP retinal ganglion cell. So these are the data I showed you before. And one of the things that we've done to be very clear is we're not going to assume that the system is additive. We're not going to assume that it's a linear system. So this is a curve we call empirical, but there was a German group that basically connected the dots and said, this is the action spectrum for the circadian system. And there's been a lot of talk lately that you can explain all of this just by melanopsin alone. And so that is the spectral sensitivity of that. Now, I think it should be obvious that melanopsin alone is not a very good explanation for the spectral sensitivity, although it's shifted to short wavelengths, you can see that it misses the data quite considerably. But this test of additivity, we have two sources. One is clear mercury. I don't even know if you can buy a clear mercury source anymore, but it has these line spectra. And you have a blue LED, which is the dotted line down at the bottom. Now, if you just do your sums, you assume it's an additive system. You take the radiant power times the action spectrum, and then you calculate how much you can, whatever normalization factor you want. The important point is that in both cases, the so-called empirical lux is 1525 for the mercury lamp, and the empirical lux is only 743 empirical lux for the blue LED. So you would reasonably expect for the same duration that the mercury would suppress more melatonin, because if it's an additive function, it has more effective radiant power reaching the retina. Seems reasonable, right? In fact, you get the opposite. So what you do is you end up that the blue LED turns out to be more effective, even though it has less determined radiant flux for that action spectrum than it would be for the clear mercury. Now, of course, you run an experiment and you think, well, maybe we got lucky, maybe it's not really true. We then went to strictly clear mercury. And what we did was we then took a bandpass filter and we just simply cut off the long wavelength. So it's exactly the same spectrum, one with a filter, one without, and at two absolute levels. And again, what you find is the filtered light that has lower radiant power is actually more efficacious at suppressing melatonin than the full mercury spectrum. Now, one more. We did one more test. At the top, what you see is a person that has a blue luminous thing over one eye and green over the other, okay? You reverse that in the next image, and then what you do is you take exactly the same radiant power, you divide it in two and put it in both eyes. So the radiant energy and the spectra are exactly the same in all three of these conditions. The difference is you segregate it for one eye at a time. The gray histograms tell you what our model predicts you should suppress, and the mean and medians are there together with it. So again, what you see is when you combine a long wavelength source with a short wavelength source, you get less effective than if you just have two monochromatic lights, in this case, one in each eye. And you can reverse the eyes and you get the same thing. So you have three tests that clearly show what we call subadditivity. And that subadditivity, we argue, is based upon the conventional B-Y spectral opponent channel. So this is, I think, from Herbage and Jameson. That shows the red, green, and the yellow, blue spectral opponent curves that you would get that explain why you never see a reddish green and never a yellowish blue. You either get blue or yellow, red, or green because they're spectrally opponent. One cell is carrying both information, but you can't have both at the same time. So what the experiment is basically is you're taking this 450 light, which can be would in fact be by itself effective, and then what you're doing is you're countering that effectiveness with the 525 light. So when you put them together, you have less net energy reaching the SCN. Now, I want to point out 500 nanometers. Here's the cross point. That is the point that is our model predictions are in dashed line from those data from the two studies we did. That inflection represents, in our opinion, this change from a blue or cool light source to a warm light source. And if you read the paper, you'll see how we explain why there is this sudden transition, an increase in sensitivity, 500 nanometers. So it's not arbitrary, and that is a pretty nice fit to the spectral data that you have. So yeah, we believe you can take a function like that, weight any spectrum you want, monochromatic or polychromatic, and be able to then determine what the biophysical definition of circadian effective light. So again, it's this two-stage model that takes into account spectral potency. And in closing, I just want to show you that the one on the left is our model spectral sensitivity curve. The dashed lines are the ones for monochromatic light. The red one represents melanopsin alone, and you can see that once you pass 500 nanometers, that pretty well explains the efficiency at long wavelengths. You'll notice the blue one, though, has a negative lobe, and that is the one that's taking into account the subadditive response. So you have a positive plus a negative that determine what it is. And this one, the red and the blue are for polychromatic lights. Now, I'm not going to get into the operating characteristic, but just to point out that if you then rectify your optical radiation with that luminous efficiency function, what you see is for all the polychromatic lights that we've run so far, plotted on one curve, you can begin to rectify all of those disparate experiments by one curve if you've weighted your spectrum correctly as we determine it in this particular model. So that's another story about the absolute sensitivity, but I just want to kind of show you where we are. Now at the top, you'll see that we've got outdoors at night, indoors in the home, indoors in offices, and then outdoors. And what you see in architectural lighting, like we're doing here, you're always on that slope. Where we evolved, you were either at saturation or you were at threshold. And so now what we need to do for the health aspects is begin to think about, well, what if I'm not up on that curve far enough? What if I'm getting too much light at night? What if I'm not getting enough light during the day? And that is a large central part of the research that we're doing at Mount Sinai now, looking at the health implications of being on that slippery slope. That's really what we've been looking at for the future. So I will close by simply saying that light, again, to remind you, is a biophysical construct. It's the only one of the fundamental quantities that includes humans. Everything else is a strictly physical world except for light. And I wanted to complicate things by making two types of light, one for vision and one for the circadian system, which we found very useful. We were now writing a paper taking that model and being able to predict what happens during the shift from daylight savings time to standard time and back. How long does it take you to re-entrain? Those are the kinds of things we want to ultimately take the science and begin to translate into practical applications. What should you do in the springtime when it switches over to the daylight savings? And I think we have some practical advice to give you so that you can sleep better sooner. So anyway, thank you very much. That's I know I'm in a critical audience, and listen, I have very thick skin, so if anybody wants to throw Rotten Tomatoes or say you're an idiot, I'm okay with that, because I'm really interested in getting the right answer. I had a very enjoyable conversation with Sarah earlier in the day, and I think we disagree on fine points, but to my knowledge, this is the only time where anybody has really tried to cross the psychophysics with the neurophysiology, and I defer to her wisdom over mine on the left. Anyway, that's where we are. Questions?
So it's interesting that the spectrum doesn't agree with melatonin. And it leads one to think.
Melanopsin, you mean?
I mean, sorry. Well, yeah.
Mel. Just say Mel.
I'm sorry. Melanopsin. So it doesn't agree with melanopsin. So it does lead one to wonder what would be the optimum spectrum for the visual system to choose to maximize entrainment.
Or minimize. I mean, minimize the stimulation. In other words, remember it's light and dark. So if you define light, you also need to define dark. Okay, I'm just sorry.
Okay, but just to get the best entrainment,
yeah.
What would you want to have, and is the shift that you observe consistent with?
Well, that's what all those
that evolutionists created a sort of optimum, given the spectra of the various options that are available. Some rational think it should be that way.
I really want to answer your question. So if I don't, you'll bring me back. I showed you, we can take any spectrum and decide where it is on that operating characteristic, right? Within uncertainties, of course. So when you say what's the best one, if you're talking about monochromatic, 460, which is not 480, by the way, because you now have a combined S-cone plus melanopsin joint sensitivity that is modeled in there, right? If you take a polychromatic light, again, a cool light source is generally more efficient at producing a circadian effective response. But if you're talking about white light, like we have here, white light differs. Cool white light is more effective than a warm white light. If you know what I mean by cool and warm. But it's small compared to the inverse square law. If I get 30% closer to a light source, I've overcome every spectral effect that I'm going to measure. People are very focused on spectrum, and I don't think that is the most important thing that you need to be concerned with. We're trying to work with the General Service Administration and the Navy to get the light levels up, further up on that operating characteristic, because it gets down on the noise and you stop knowing what's day and what's night. So it's the contrast that you really have to look at. So, which adds another complication. It is an absolute response. You have to think about what both light and dark are doing. And that's why I brought up the dark. You also need to know what dark is to really tell you how effective the light's going to be for entrainment in the circadian system. I'm not sure I answered your question, but I tried.
Jim? Well, just kind of following on that for a second. So there are two commercial things that happen. One, optometrists push these blue lens glasses, which basically filter, they have a yellow tint. Right. And then also our electronic brethren, so to speak, are pushing night mode, where they change the spectrum of this. So getting back to this light versus dark, by wearing quote unquote blue light glasses, are we suppressing the blue in the morning? And is it true that these quote unquote night modes are sufficiently filtered to not stimulate melatonin?
But the direction is right, but not the magnitude. So this filtering, the tinting that you have, if you put in too strong a yellow filter, the world's going to look strange. You just, so nobody wants to wear that. But you're not really talking about a serious filter. It's not like zeros and ones, right? You still have enough energy in a filtered lens that we've looked at anyway from Essilor or whoever to show that, you know, it's less efficient at stimulating it, but it's not going to zero. It's not like you're going to lose sleep because we have tested the night mode and it goes in the right direction, but it's not particularly effective. It's how bright that screen is turns out to be much more important than what you intended. It goes in the right direction though. I'm not being dismissive. It's just you have to do your sums. You get the direction right, and that's what the marketing people do. They get the direction right, but then they don't tell you what the magnitude is. And that's why you need, in my judgment, a model like we've done to be able to make those kinds of statements. So we can quantify that light and how effective it's going to be. But I want to put a caveat on that because I don't know what you got yesterday. And if I don't know what you got yesterday, I don't know how effective that particular instantaneous light measurement might be.
One just quick follow-up. I know a lot of people can fly west easier than flying east.
True.
Is there a reason for that?
God wanted it that way. We're trying to advance our clock every morning that we do that. And it turns out that it's harder to advance than it is to delay. Most people, because we have presumably an intrinsic period longer than 24 hours, we carry it through. I'm not a full believer in that interpretation, but empirically it is true that flying in one direction to the west is easier to re-entrain than it is flying east.
And also the light in the destination, when you come back, it's more conducive to delay. When you go there, it's not conducive to advance.
Yeah, I mean, Mariana makes a good point. It depends on what your exposure is. So if you're flying west, the light will help you delay your clock to the new time. If you're flying east and you look out the window as you land, you're getting in the delay phase and you don't want to do that. So yes, exposure after you land is going to be critical on how we see it. Yeah.
So I think it's interesting how the spectral gradients changes when you consider the effect on melatonin production and how it's centered above blue. And I'm just thinking, like, evolutionarily, like, what's blue? The sky is blue. And, you know, humanity started evolving in like tropical regions in Africa. I'm just wondering, maybe if you look at people who like were a vast majority of their evolutionary history occurred in cloudier places, if that curve shifts. If you look at like indigenous people in Canada, for example.
Well, the sky's blue most of the time.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is mouse has a UV sensor. right? And there's a lot of UV in the dome. And if you're a small critter that's nocturnal, you're the first to know that it's about to be daytime and it's time to head into the thing. So I think that the blue is a natural thing, even if on a cloudy day, it's very much dominated with short wavelengths. And so you end up with blue is a very powerful signal for indicating daytime. And then the absence, obviously not. And I would speculate that we sit around in an incandescent fire in the evening, that's a yellow light. It turns out to be less effective than the blue. And again, you can see, but it provides that circadian contrast for training. I may have overstated my welcome.
No. You're fine. I was going to ask you that, so that means if I'm, let's say, I would bring back, I'm traveling and I want to come back to the local time faster. You're saying I should expose myself with blue light that will bring me faster to the local
At
time?
the right time, because you can really screw it up if you expose you to blue light at the wrong time. Okay, so we're developing sort of some heuristics that allow you to interpret that. Some people are what we call larks, and they have a different recipe for that than an owl, which tends to be a night person. So teenagers and young adults tend to be owls. They tend to stay up late after midnight.
Right.
By the time you get to my age, I'm asleep at 8:30.
Yes. So you didn't talk a lot about the regularity and depth of diurnal rhythms, but there must be is there some temporal component? You talked about the fact that it's not spectrum, intensity is way more important to avoid just before you go to sleep. Does that actually carry over into your full rhythm?
If I understand your question. What the light of the night will do will shift the phase. And then you fall asleep, then the amplitude will remain the same. You've just shifted the curve. However, if you're a shift worker and you're exposed to light, and let's say you're a night shift worker, you will dampen the amplitude of the response. So the way we say it is every photon counts. And so you really have to make sure that you know what your light dark pattern is, what time you awake, what time you sleep to make a reasonable prediction of. And when I say amplitude, we tend to measure melatonin, which may be different than cortisol or something else, right? So I'm shorthanding it by saying melatonin, but that's not the only biomarker you use.
But is melatonin really consistent with sleep depth and all of those things that people talk about?
Well, the way I interpret melatonin, it is, you can't have a neuron connecting to every cell in your body. So you use this hormone to flow through the bloodstream to reset those clocks that are in the periphery. I will say that it's a 0 and 1. It says melatonin must be night. Now I'm going to go to this function, whatever it is. I don't know what it means. I don't know if you modify the amplitude, how is the cell in your toe going to respond to that? I don't know the answer to that question, right? But I do think that amplitude probably is as important as phase, but I can't say. Okay. Do you want to say something, Marianne, on that? Amplitude and phase?
You mean in terms of what melatonin is?
Well, I'm just saying that's the marker we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things about melatonin is it is a timing messenger. It's not necessarily a sleeping pill. I think a lot of what people are using is that as if it is a sleeping pill, and it's not. It really is almost like telling your biological clock, gee, it's nighttime. It's time for you to prepare to go to bed. So you feel sleepy, you fall asleep because you just shift to that nighttime mode. And, you know, there's a lot of criticism now in the sleep community about giving a lot of melatonin to kids that don't sleep, to everybody. And there's a lot of concern because nobody knows the long-term effects of taking high doses of melatonin every day. Just to give you an idea, we produce it in picograms per ml. You take 5 milligrams. It's a huge dose, and nobody knows what it means to the system if you do that for long periods of time.
Whether it's a placebo or not, some people do that and they swear by it.
Sure.
So
it does help with jet lag. That's one thing that it does, because what melatonin does is the opposite of light. Light advances the clock in the morning melatonin advances the clock in the evening. So a lot of people use for jet lag and it does help, but this is a short term, right? This is just only when you travel. It's not something that you're taking every night to go to sleep, and that's really the criticism.
But it's the pharmaceutical choice of people that are dealing with kids with autism.
Yeah.
And when they overprescribe melatonin without really knowing what the implications are. So we don't know. I don't want to imply that we do. Yeah, sorry. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I had a question about the retina circuit that you showed a number of times. If I understood, you're explaining the spectral dependence on the spectrally opponent channel that's found in the retina. I'm wondering if you've considered, I didn't see it in your model, David Berson's early work showed that that melanopsin is a bistable photopigment, and basically if you use red light, that you're gonna effectively quench the activation of melanopsin. And I haven't stayed abreast of literature since those early reports, but I didn't see that in your model, and I was wondering why you chose to omit it, or if you favor the spectrally opponent photoreceptor.
We tried that, and we could see no effect of the red light exposure. Now we're dealing with whole humans, right? So at a cellular level, maybe, but we couldn't see any effects of red light. Any effect whatsoever on our outcome measure. No.
Well, at levels that are.
Sure, we're
Right.
taking a shot in the dark, right? So I'm not saying red light doesn't, I'm just saying for yes, the experimental paradigm. But we tried to use something that would have been practical to do, and we just didn't see any effect at all.
But at the neurophysiological level, you'd agree that people have found that red light will quench the.
Well, it's still difficult. I mean, you have a very different way of regeneration from traditional rods and cones to pigment epithelium. These ganglion cells are sitting out all by themselves. So how are they going to do that? And red light is one of the hypotheses that talks about regenerating the photopigment. And I have no knowledge personally of anything that would support it or not.
Yeah, we actually tried one study with a student
Yeah,
and we never saw it. So there was a lot of hype when the bistable idea came out, and then it kind of died out. I haven't seen much work on that lately. People stopped talking about it. So it was a hypothesis, and it's still sort of a quote unquote mystery or something that's still in the hypothesis.
Yeah,
what is it, the regeneration? But we tried on the melatonin suppression where we had red light and then exposure to blue light. So prior exposure to red light, and we didn't see any difference in acute melatonin suppression. So, at the downstream level, we weren't able to see that impacting. And
We thought we would. That's why we did it.
And since the model is trying to figure out more of the downstream, so yes, that's something that if something more it's done, we probably ought to look at it, but we haven't been able to show.
If you're constantly exposed under very high brightness of light, for example, people in the prison, do they develop some resistance to
Prison, you said.
yes, because
Sorry.
they're like people in the cells, and they have the light turned on 24/7. So do those kind of people develop some resistance to light because you said the light will reset your clock in the morning or during the day?
But coincidentally, we were doing a study at Women's Correctional Facility in Ohio, looking specifically at that. But they do get in 1 hour darkness. It's not on 20.
Okay.
But here's the thing, there has been studies showing that if in cases with solitary stuff, that what happens is it disrupts the sleep to a point where they start having delirium. So it's not that they get sensitized, they get just totally messed up because they don't have a circadian
Yeah,
rhythm.
there's no chance to get a rhythm.
So you start affecting mental health and other.
But that's true of any sleep deprivation that you're going to do. And since circadian is half of the story on sleep regulation, if you mess that up, then you're not going to have consolidated sleep. You're going to potentially end up with having hallucinations and so on. And so that's actually the reason why we're doing that study in Ohio.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so you talked about the implications of this for industry and for, I guess, public health and architecture. So how much of this is going, I mean, is used in providing sunlight and a good lighting in rooms, and how much is it going to the like lighting industry, and how much is on devices that like prescribe light through helmets or something like that?
But this is, what we find is that people don't like stuff on their face. They'll do it for a little while, but they don't really like it. And so we're working with the General Services Administration now to do things like get light solely out of the ceiling down to the surface. So working with furniture manufacturers, for example, they have luminous panels during the daytime and so on, but your traditional companies, which is dominant, that make ceiling fixtures, I don't think would you say we've had much impact on them? I mean, not much. So I think we have to go to a different part, to a different industry to really make that effective. Now, we have worked with people that make those goggles and things like that, but from an ergonomic point of view, most people don't like it. Some people won't even wear glasses. So you always have to take into account the ergonomics as well as the biology to really be effective. So our sense is that if we can, you just show up and it's just there, that's going to be a more effective way to do it than it is to try to ask people to change their behavior. But I don't have a definite word on that. You understand? I didn't mislead you to say, yeah, that's the right answer. We're trying things because we do want to make that translation. And where we have done it, studies led by Mariana, for example, showed that if people coincidentally get high levels of light during the day at their eye, compared to the same building, people who don't, like the ones in the offices I was in today, they're disasters, by the way. Those people end up with more depression, they have poor sleep, and they just have negative outcomes because they're not getting bright light during the day. Windows really are a good thing. But that's really the only practical way you can do it now, because trying to dump more lumens out of the ceiling is pretty inefficient. Right. So the other thing is interesting.
Oh, you can.
The other interesting thing, the General Services Administration is working with their management, that there are going to be people that are stuck in interior offices. And they've got the management to let them go into atria and places like that to work for a couple hours every day. So management allowing people to do that. And another interesting statistic from GSA, 85% of the workers in the federal government do hybrid working. That means only 15% of the people either go exclusively at home or exclusively in the office. And so they're trying to get people to understand circadian rhythms when they do and buy things for the home, which is the other place that's really critical to manage your light exposure. So it's a heavy lift, try to get it in practice, but it isn't just a simple technology fix. It's working with management and ergonomics and everything else to make it work.
It has to be like throughout the day, or kind of exposure of an hour of outside.
We, in the interest of energy efficiency and minimizing things, we think that a minimum of 2 hours a day for bright light in the morning is a cheap way to go. It's much better if you're switching all day long. I mean, that's a good solution, but most people aren't willing to do that, right? So 2 hours is the way we work with General Services Administration, because we thought that was a practical compromise. The data show that more than 2 hours, it doesn't really help.
We're in training.
We're in training.
We can take the last question from Jim.
So just following up on that, hospitals are terrible environments for natural lighting.
Yes.
And people who are doing very critical skills often have very strange schedules. And the lighting in hospitals tends to be prescribed, perhaps not by circadian rhythms.
God knows why.
What would be your comment about how hospitals should light for both patient health and physician nursing health?
Well, I'm going to defer to Mariana because she's working in that right now. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, amen, because it is. I have not been to a hospital that has good lighting. But the problem is, the answer to every why question is money. We've been trying to, since I started at Sinai, we've been trying to work with Sinai to try to change the lighting. We are doing a study right now with myeloma transplant patients where we're adding lights in the room for the patients during the transplant. And we are seeing positive impact on sleep, on symptom burden, on inflammatory markers. I mean, it's obvious, but it's an uphill battle. I mean, it's just not an easy thing to do
It's not
because,
a pill. That's one of the real things.
and people don't care. I mean, it's just, okay, just put it in the ceiling and if you can see, you're all set. And show me the data. Well, those trials are expensive. They take time to collect the data. And one study is not going to be enough. They're going to want, multiple trials in multiple hospitals before they can even consider changing anything. So I unfortunately don't see anything getting better in my lifetime, but all I can do is try to generate the data, and that's what we've been working on. But it's a reality.
I just want to add one thing. Every time we can go in and control light dark pattern, we see positive results in the field. So you don't need a tightly controlled study to show the benefits that you're going to get from bright days to dim days. It appears to be universal. We've never really seen a failed experiment in that regard. So, but getting it delivered is a challenge. Products aren't there. Knowledge isn't there. The desire isn't there. It's an uphill battle because it isn't a field. It's a matter of changing lifestyle and infrastructure.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.